Sup, y'all? Welcome back to another Under the Blanket session with the JY. Last time we left off, we were reading about money. Or rather, we were talking about deafness and love, but now we're moving on to money. Money was a source of constant anxiety for Beethoven, and understandably so, for when it came to making a living as an independent composer, his ideals collided with reality in ways that were at times brutal. Throughout his career, he sought a fixed court position that would assure him a steady and reliable source of income. He failed at every turn. Bad timing played a major role. Beethoven came of age in an era when court appointments of that kind he desired were rapidly becoming extinct. 2 decades of war and inflation had drained the coffers of those aristocratic families that had grown accustomed to employing their own private orchestras, and the directors to lead them. Haydn, almost 40 years older than Beethoven, had made his career in a very different musical world. He had spent nearly 3 decades as Kapellmeister, master of the Kapelle, the ensemble of instrumentalists and singers, for a single noble family, the Esterházys. In their winter palace in Vienna and summer palace in what is now Hungary, Haydn had at his disposal what was by all accounts one of the leading orchestras of Europe. Supported by a prince both willing and able to spend lavishly on his court's musical life. The summer palace even had its own opera house and marionette theater. Haydn was responsible for all aspects of music at the court, hiring and firing, rehearsing, performing, composing. My prince, as he told one of his biographers late in life, was satisfied with all my works. I received applause, and as the director of an orchestra, I could make experiments and observe what elicited and weakened an impression, and thereby improve, add, delete, take chances. I was cut off from the world. No one in my vicinity could cause me to doubt myself and torment me, and so I had to become original. There were drawbacks to this arrangement. End quote. I had to be original. End quote. There were drawbacks to this arrangement, to be sure. It was not until the 1770s that Haydn received permission to sell his own compositions, and even as late as 1790 he was still chafing at the prince's restriction on his freedom to travel. But he enjoyed a steady income and could concentrate on his work. These were precisely the goals that would elude Beethoven. They had eluded Mozart for the most part as well. After moving to Vienna in 1781, he repeatedly sought a permanent appointment of some kind that could do no better than a minor and essentially part-time position at the imperial court. The responsibilities were few, the pay was modest, and the inevitable palace intrigues did not help. In the end, Mozart had to string together an income from his published music, performances of his operas, concertizing, and giving private lessons. So this is my note, but this is like kind of the reason why I think Haydn's music is not very impactful is that Mozart and Beethoven had to really fight to make meaning out of their music, and they had to try really hard to get money, whereas Haydn had a real cushy job. So he had like the most resources available to him to experiment, but because he didn't really have his skin on the line, his life on the line, I think that a lot of his works are generally pretty safe works. Back to Bonds. For all his connections at court and among the aristocracy, Beethoven was even less successful. He assured the publisher Franz Anton Hofmeister in 1803 that he would gladly convey to him all his new works to publish if that alone would assure him of sufficient income. Quote, "Yet consider that everyone around me holds appointments and knows exactly what they have to live on. But good Lord, Where would one appoint such a parvum talentem quam ego at the imperial court? End quote. There is a distinct tone of bitterness beneath Beethoven's self-deprecatory jest about his small talent. Quite aside from a lack of long-term financial security, he resented the incalculable hours devoted to what he called sour business of haggling over fees with publishers. In another letter to Hofmeister, he sketched out a possible way to avoid this: a storehouse of art, Magazin der Kunst, to which the artist would only have to hand over his works in order to take in return what he needed. Commentators have since noted the congruence of this scheme with Karl Marx's later dictum, quote, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his need." Beethoven knew full well that this was another one of his utopian ideals, and altogether unworkable, especially in Vienna in the early 1800s. In the meantime, he mused in his diary about traveling and eventually securing a position in a small court with a small musical ensemble and performing there a hymn to the glory of the Almighty, of the eternally infinite. On another occasion, he entertained the idea of serving at the court of Napoleon in Paris. Even as late as 1822, when he learned about the death of Anton Taber, the Habsburg court composer, he was making inquiries behind the scenes about securing an appointment as Taber's successor. The only meaningful offer Beethoven ever received came in October 1808, not from Napoleon, but from Napoleon's youngest brother Jerome, ruler of the newly formed kingdom of Westphalia. For all his claimed indifference to titles and nobility, Beethoven became quite agitated when the press reported the nature and circumstances of the offer incorrectly. He wrote to the editors of Leipzig's Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung, I guess it's a magazine, asking them to set the record straight. Quote, "I thank you for the article, but I request that you at some point correct the matter as concerns the composer Johann Friedrich Reichardt. It was not in any way engaged by him. To the contrary, it was the chief chamberlain of His Majesty, the King of Westphalia, Crown Churches Waldberg, who arranged to have the offer made to me, and specifically as Chief Kapellmeister of His Majesty of Westphalia. At the next opportunity you should present the truth about the matter, for it is vital for my honor. I laugh at such matters, but there are those miserables who know how to cook up and serve such things." I guess he wanted to know, Beethoven clearly placed a great weight on exactly who made the offer to him and the exact title of the position. He writes Erster Kapellmeister, first and chief music director, in large letters that underlines each word 3 times. His claim that he laughs at such things rings hollow, given his table-pounding insistence that the record be corrected. In the end, Beethoven declined Jerome's offer and leveraged it for the annuity of 1809 that kept him in Vienna. For the moment, at least, he seemed to have achieved his goal of a steady income, and better still, without the responsibilities that came with any court position. The reality of the arrangement played out quite differently. Only Archduke Rudolf paid his share from the start. Contributions from Princes Kinsky and Lobkowitz got tied up in legal battles that dragged on for 6 years before being settled. And inflation ate away at the original value of the fund. Over the long term, the annuity did provide a steady source of income, but one smaller than Beethoven had at first anticipated, and in any case insufficient by itself to support him adequately, even according to his own relatively modest standard of living. In the end, he was able to afford a servant and cook, and though he had to borrow funds from time to time, he was always able to repay his debts. He even lent money on occasion, most notably to his brother, Caspar Karl. Like Mozart before him, Beethoven had to make his living by drawing on a variety of sources. Beyond the support of patrons, the grant from Prince Lichnowsky early on and the annuity of 1809 later, And we're still talking about Beethoven. His primary sources of income were performing, teaching, commissions, and sales of his published works. Performing, both in public and in private, could be lucrative if unpredictable and sporadic. Particularly in his early years in Vienna, Beethoven played the piano frequently in the palaces of his aristocratic patrons and received some form of payment in return. He also organized a number of occasional concerts, academies as they were called, for a ticket-buying public that would have included many of those same aristocratic patrons. Beethoven typically served as impresario, composer, conductor, and piano soloist at these events and kept the profits for himself after covering the expenses. For his first such production in 1800, the most interesting academy in quite a while, one contemporary reviewer remarked. He rented out one of the city's major theaters, hired an orchestra, and presented a program that paid homage to his two great predecessors in the form of a symphony by Mozart and two arias by Haydn's creation, but otherwise consisted entirely of his own works. The Piano Concerto No. 1, the Septet, Opus 20, an improvisation at the keyboard, and as a grand finale, the premiere of the First Symphony. More ambitious still was the Academy of December 22, 1808, in the theater of Der Wien. Its all-Beethoven program consisted of the Fourth Piano Concerto, with the composer as soloist, the concert aria A Perfido, Opus 65, the Gloria and Sanctus from the Mass in C, Opus 86, a solo improvisation on the piano, and the premieres of the Fifth and Sixth Symphonies. As if all this were not enough, the evening concluded with the premiere of the Choral Fantasy, Opus 80. But there things fell off the rails. Beethoven had to stop the performance in order to get all the musicians on the same page. He later apologized for humiliating them, who, like the audience, had had to endure not only Beethoven's temper, but also 4 hours of bitter evening cold. The composer Johann Friedrich Reichardt stayed to the end and concluded that one could have, quote, too much of a good, and beyond that powerful, thing. Beethoven did not like teaching. He considered it a drain on his time and energy. Even in his early years in Vienna, he took on only a few piano students, and in 1801 a single composition student, Ferdinand Ries, the son of a family friend from Bonn. Ries also doubled as the composer's personal assistant for the next several years. Beethoven's only other composition student from about 1809 onward was the Archduke Rudolph, a more than competent composer and by all accounts an excellent pianist. Theirs was an unusual relationship, for he was a patron as well as a student. Small wonder that Beethoven could dedicate some of his most important works to him, including the Piano Concertos 58 and 73 being the Fifth Piano Concerto, the Emperor, the Piano Sonata Opus 81A, Les Adieux, the Violin Sonata Opus 96, the Piano Trio Opus 97, simply called the Archduke, the Piano Sonatas Opus 106, the Hammerklavier, and 111, the Missa Solemnis, Opus 123, and the Grosse Fugue, Opus 133. The relationship was complicated still further by Rudolph's familiar connections to the very center of power at the Habsburg court, where he was the youngest brother of the Emperor Franz I. Two themes emerged from the correspondence: gratitude and resentment. On the one hand, Beethoven was grateful for the Archduke's steadfast support for the 1809 On the one hand, Beethoven was grateful for the Archduke's steadfast support for the 1809 annuity and for the payments he received for lessons, which again was up front. More important still was the prospect of a permanent court position, yet he begrudged the time devoted to lessons and especially resented the idea of being available at a moment's notice to accommodate the Archduke's schedule. Finally, Beethoven's own compositions. These produced income in multiple ways. The dedicatee of any new work would typically reward the composer with some sort of payment. Prince Lobkowitz, for example, gave the composer 400 gulden in return for the dedication of the Eroica Symphony, along with exclusive rights of performance by the prince's own private orchestra for half a year. That sum alone represented 2/3 of the annual support he was receiving at the time from Prince Lichnowsky. There was also the occasional commission, such as the Count Ramovsky's request of 3-string quartets, Prince Nicolau II Esterhazy's call for a setting of the Mass, or Prince Galitzin's invitation for 1, 2, or 3 new string quartets, which eventually became Opus 127, 130, and 132. Beethoven could also solicit subscriptions, advance purchases for new works, as he did in the case of Opus 1, piano trios, and the Missa Solemnis. Beethoven assured publishers on more than one occasion that he did not write for money alone, but in the next breath he would almost invariably try to negotiate a higher payment, and he would occasionally sell the same work to more than one publisher. While this might strike us today as unethical, we should remember that there was no effective system of international copyright at the time, and that publishers themselves often issued pirated editions of their own. Great Britain, in particular, functioned as a largely separate market from that on the continent, and Beethoven did a lively business with British publishers. He also had to think about which genres would work, more or less to his advantage. As he confessed to the publisher C.F. Peters in a half-joking, half-serious letter in 1818 to his friend, the cellist, Vincent Hoschka, he reported from rural Modling outside Vienna that he was, quote, rambling about in the mountains, ravines, and valleys, here with a piece of music paper, smearing various things on it for the sake of bread and money. For I have reached such heights in this all-powerful former land of the Phaeacians, that in order to gain some time to write a great work, I must first do a vast amount of scribbling for the sake of money, so that I can survive while writing a great work. End quote. The category of great or large works played a key role in Beethoven's vision of his calling. While the dividing line between these and presumably lesser genres is not always clear, he seems to have thought of symphonies, masses, and operas as qualitatively different from sonatas, string quartets, and songs. He repeatedly expressed the wish to devote himself to large-scale works, even while recognizing the far greater public demand for compositions in smaller genres. My situation demands that I take every advantage into consideration, he wrote to C.F. Peters, one of his publishers, in 1823. Once he had resolved to work in a particular genre, however, he focused on the task at hand. Quote, thank God I never think about the advantage in writing smaller scale works, he assures Peters, but only about how I write. This was true enough. His contemporary detractors complained repeatedly about the difficulty of his music, no matter what the genre, and even his supporters conceded that his works were challenging for performers and listeners alike. From a purely technical point of view, his music was hard to play, and it ran counter to convention so often that listeners had trouble absorbing it. Beethoven knew this, as he wrote to the pianist and composer Andreas Streicher in 1796, quote, I am satisfied even if only a few understand me. This is a long, end quote. This is a long way from his teacher Haydn's alleged and widely circulated statement that his own music language was, quote, understood throughout the world, end quote. It also contradicts the spirit of Mozart's oft-quoted assertion that he had written a set of 3 piano concertos in such a way as to appeal to connoisseurs and amateurs alike. In this respect, Beethoven's attitude was radical. He could not and did not ignore the music-consuming public's tastes and abilities altogether, but he did challenge them repeatedly. This came at the cost of bad notices. Reviewing a set of early variations released in 1799, one critic sniffed that, quote, "Ere Beethoven may be able to fantasize, but how to vary is something he doesn't understand well." End quote. The variations, in other words, were so imaginative that they departed unrecognizably and thus unacceptably from the original theme. The set as a whole, moreover, was marred by ugly dissonances and a generally labored nature. Another critic that same year took the composer to task for going his own particular way in the three violin sonatas of Opus 12, and, quote, "in what a bizarre, cumbersome way, a hunt for unusual modulations, a loathing for conventional transitions, a piling up of difficulty upon difficulty to such an extent that one loses all patience and joy in the process." End quote. And these, it should be noted, were responses to works that today are scarcely considered to be among the composer's more innovative, meaning that they were basically talking about certain pieces of Beethoven's that seemed really outlandish, when today we listen to those things and think that those are quintessential Beethoven, and we don't think that it's too crazy now that he wrote all that stuff. Back to Bonds. Reviews of this kind from Beethoven's day are too common to be ignored and dismissed simply as the product of small minds. Then, as now, there was the occasional dullard critic, but listeners at the time simply did not consider it their responsibility to make sense of what a composer had written. The composer's obligation, as they saw it, was to satisfy listeners, not puzzle them. In retrospect, then, we can see that Beethoven's career coincided with a period of transition in the history of listening, for the idea of listeners making an effort to grasp the thought of a composer would not become common until later in the 19th century. Negative reviews also inevitably cut into sales. Quote, "Advise your reviewers to show more discretion and intelligence," end quote. Beethoven wrote to the editors of Leipzig's leading musical journal in 1801. "Make sure your reviewers are saying smarter things," he said to a music journal. And critics did in fact adjust gradually. They initially regarded the Eroica Symphony, for example, as diffuse and overly long, but it became an audience favorite within a few years. By the end of the composer's life, only the works of the late period continued to puzzle audiences, though by that time at least some critics were willing to give the composer the benefit of the doubt. One reviewer, who could make no sense of the Grosse Fugue, Opus 133, called it incomprehensible, like Chinese, but hastened to add that we nevertheless do not want to dismiss things too hastily. Perhaps a time will come when that which on first sight seemed to us opaque and muddled will be recognized as clear and pleasing forms. The delusion of the words of St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 13:12, "For now we see through a glass darkly and then face to face," suggests that Beethoven's music had by now achieved the kind of respect normally accorded Holy Writ. What a interesting section about money, but also towards the end really about what is even Beethoven's music, how was it received. And yeah, Beethoven had a lot of expectations for his performers and his listeners, and he was in kind of this like period of political turmoil, and so a lot of his works are a lot of context behind his works. That was the end of chapter 6. Let's read chapter 7 too. Chapter 7, Politics. Ugh. Getting some weird gas as I read this. Beethoven was born into and died in a world of strict social hierarchies. The most fundamental division was that between nobility and commoners. Each of these realms, in turn, had its own defined strata, from emperors to common nobility, from affluent merchants to common laborers. Musicians occupied a roughly middle position in the ranks of non nobility. Society regarded them as highly skilled craftsmen. Those who, like Beethoven's grandfather, rose to the position of Kapellmeister, musical director, could generally count themselves among the highest paid members of a court's staff. Beethoven was also born into a world in social and political flux. He was 18 years old when the French Revolution broke out, and he witnessed changes that transformed not only the map of Europe, but his mind as well. Small wonder, then, that his own political views so often seemed contradictory. His attitude toward Napoleon, the most important political figure of the day, lurched from one extreme to the other. He was inspired by the French leader's ideals and planned to dedicate the Third Symphony to him, at one point even calling the work Bonaparte. But at some point, possibly when he learned in 1804 that the first consul had crowned himself emperor, he cancelled the name so violently on one copyist manuscript that his quill ripped a hole in the paper, and he renamed the work Sinfonia Eroica, the Heroic Symphony. But now the contradictions begin. He later added in pencil at the bottom of the same manuscript's title page, Geschrieben auf Bonaparte, written on Bonaparte. He suffered tremendous pain in his ears when Napoleon's troops bombarded Vienna in May 1809, and in a marginal note to the score of the Fifth Piano Concerto, which he began sketching around the same time, observed that, quote, Austria owes Napoleon payback. A few weeks later, he asked a visiting French officer if he thought Napoleon would receive him in Vienna, and soon afterward gave serious consideration to becoming Kapellmeister to Napoleon's brother at the court of the Kingdom of Westphalia. The following year, he contemplated dedicating his Mass in C, Opus 86, to Napoleon. Then, in 1813, he wrote the hugely popular Wellington's Victory, an orchestral work that portrayed in graphic musical detail one of Napoleon's key defeats. A year later, he contributed to the celebrations surrounding the Congress of Vienna, which established a blueprint for post-Napoleonic Europe. What are we to make of so many contradictions? Once again, Beethoven's ideals had collided with reality. Almost everything he said or did about politics was to be evaluated through a prism of his overarching drive to fulfill his calling to compose. He embraced the core ideals of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity, and was appalled when Napoleon's actions violated them. Higher still, though, was his own vision to produce everything he felt called upon to bring forth, as he had put it in his Heiligenstadt Testament of 1802. This objective took precedence over all else, and by 1809 he had come to realize that an appointment as Kapellmeister, no matter how imperfect the court, offered the best path to his goal. The ruler at his own court in Vienna, after all, was scarcely a paragon of liberty, equality, and fraternity. So I guess he had to bite at his ideals to get money, huh? Tempting as it may be, then, we should not read too much of Beethoven's personal views into the seemingly reactionary pieces he wrote for the Congress of Vienna. The cantata Der glorreiche Augenblick, the glorious moments, and the chorus Ihr weisen Gründer glücklicher Staaten, ye wise founders of fortunate nations, both to texts lauding the assembling rulers and the Germania for bass solo, chorus, and orchestra, arousing pain to an imagined German state. Oh, that was a really crazy paragraph, hard to read. True to form, Beethoven viewed the whole affair from multiple perspectives. He recognized the opportunities the Congress would present in the form of commissions, which he duly fulfilled, and of potential gifts, which he duly received. The Empress of Russia, impressed by works like the Seventh Symphony and Wellington's Victory, sent him a gift of 200 gold ducats, roughly twice the annual income of an experienced musician at the court opera, and he reciprocated by dedicating to her his Polonaise for piano, opus 89. He also knew that these illustrious visitors would need to be entertained. The prestigious Kartner Theater presented Fidelio some 33 times between May 1814 and July 1815, and Beethoven gave no fewer than 3 academies over the course of the Congress. The last of these was a benefit concert for the almshouse of St. Mark's, conducted by the composer himself. In recognition of this act of generosity, the city of Vienna granted him honorary citizenship. Beethoven was also able to take a more jaundiced view of things. As he wrote in the fall of 1814 to the lawyer Johann Nepomukka in Prague, himself an amateur composer and pianist, quote, "As you yourself know, the creative spirit must not be shackled by the miserable needs of life. I shall report nothing to you of our monarchs, etc., our monarchies, etc. The newspapers will tell you everything. The empire of the mind, das Geisterreich, is the one dearest to me and the one superior to all spiritual and secular monarchies." The empire of Geist, the German noun, is notoriously untranslatable. Mind is probably the best we can do in English, but it goes far beyond intellect to encompass the spirit or soul, as well as a certain sense of verve and wit, what the French called esprit, and as far as Geist was concerned, Beethoven considered himself superior to any and all members of nobility, for his was a nobility of the spirit. Quote, "As for being noble," he wrote to Schindler in 1823, "I believe I have sufficiently shown you that I am so in principle." End quote. Like so many noblemen, he also had no difficulty looking down on commoners. In August 1794, he reported to his friend Nikolaus Simrock in Bonn that, quote, "Important persons here have been locked up. There was supposed to have been a revolution, but I believe that the Austrian would not revolt as long as he has some brown ale and sausages." End quote. That's true. I mean, if you've got food, you don't need a revolt, right? Back to Bonds. And in the much later legal battle over guardianship of his nephew, he wanted nothing to do with the city's court for commoners, which he dismissed as suitable only for innkeepers, cobblers, and tailors. He certainly never corrected those who mistook the von in his name, a common surname prefix in the Low Countries for von, an indicator of nobility in German-speaking lands. It's hard to read that part correctly, but basically, Beethoven, Ludwig von Beethoven, V-A-N, means Ludwig from Beethoven, right? But V-O-N, von, not V-A-N, but Beethoven von, or Ludwig von Beethoven, V-O-N, means nobility in German. So some people didn't see him as somebody from the fields, but somebody who was German noble. Back to Bonds. In practice, Beethoven had to navigate carefully among his noble patrons, even as they negotiated their own dealings with him, for patronage was a mutually beneficial relationship. He used the nobility to enhance his reputation and income, and the nobility used him to enhance its cultural prestige. Music making was an important feature of life in Viennese salons, and his ready-made connections to the court through the early patronage of Maximilian Franz helped him establish his footing in the upper echelons of Viennese society with relative ease. Maintaining those connections over the long term proved more difficult. For all the nobility's professions of friendship and affection, distinctions of class inevitably arose and grated on the composer time and again. A romantic attachment to any patron's daughter was out of the question. He was not one of their kind. and he resented in particular the slightest hint of servitude. Even Prince Lichnowsky, who had been so extraordinarily generous to him for so many years, fell victim to the composer's sensitivity on this point. While entertaining a group of French officers at his Silesian estate in 1806, the prince asked Beethoven to perform at the piano. He refused, tensions escalated, and he left the estate that night in a rage. Back in Vienna, he smashed his plaster bust of Lichnowsky by throwing it to the floor, declaring, "The nobility are all dogs." Napoleon's conquest of Vienna in May 1809 brought politics closer to home in even more tangible ways. The battles fought just across the Danube at Augsburg-Essling, an Austrian victory, and at Wagram, a decisive Austrian defeat, filled the city with wounded and dying soldiers. Casualties from Wagram alone are estimated to have been around 72,000, the costliest battle in European history up to that point. Quote, "What a destructive, desolate life around me," Beethoven reported to a publisher in Leipzig. Quote, "Nothing but drums, cannons, and human misery of all kinds. My current situation compels me once again to haggle with you." Which, I think in the Heroic Symphony, Symphony number 3, his death march is quite somber. It's like you're actually walking through the camp of one of the armies after a battle, and you just see tons of wounded and dead people. So yeah, seeing death up close like this probably had an influence on some of that. Back to Bonds. Like many of his musical colleagues in Vienna, Beethoven was caught up in the patriotic fervor sweeping the city, and he capitalized on it. He wrote several marches for military band and started to make a setting of the poet Heinrich Joseph von Collins, Art Österreich über alles, Austria above all else. The events of the day found their way into the piano sonata in E flat, opus 81A, through its title Les Adieux, farewell, and its movement headings, which reflect the departure of Archduke Rudolph from Vienna in advance of the approaching French troops in May 4, 1809, the first movement, his absence over the ensuing months, the slow movement, and his return on January 30th, 1810, the finale. The opening notes of the first movement's slow introduction are even underlaid with the German word Lebewohl, farewell. Critics have often pointed to this sonata as Exhibit A in drawing direct connections between Beethoven's life and works. In truth, it reminds us that the motivations behind any given composition could be multi-layered. We now know that the title and descriptive movement headings were added after the music had already been written. The entire sonata conforms to the standard format of the genre. A fast first movement is followed by a slow, contemplative middle movement, and the whole concludes with a fast, jubilant finale. Aside from the opening slow introduction, in itself not unusual, the bulk of the first movement is quite lively and spry. The sonata thus masks a more complicated relationship with a member of the royal family and by extension with royalty in general. In a remarkably blunt note to himself on a sketch leaf from October 1810, just a little more than 8 months after Archduke Rudolph's return to Vienna, Beethoven memorialized his thoughts on the matter. Quote, "It should be clear enough to you for all time that the requirement to be near the Archduke always puts you in the most tense state. Hence the gout-like constraint when staying with him in the countryside. There is always a tense relationship, and this is not suitable for a true artist, for the artist can be a servant only to the muse he worships." End quote. Nor does the situation seem to have changed much over the next decade. In 1818, he wrote to his former pupil Ferdinand Ries, who was by this time in London, that, quote, "My favorite connection to this Archduke has brought me close to beggardom. I can't see myself starving. I have to give in. so you can contemplate how I suffer all the more in these circumstances. End quote. Beethoven could not afford to say such things in public to friends in Vienna, for police and paid informants were part of everyday life. Censorship had become increasingly stringent under the rule of the Emperor Franz, and all the more so later under the eye of his close adviser, Clement von Metternich, the Chancellor of State. If the ideals of the Clement de Metternich is kind of famous, isn't he? If the ideals of the French Revolution were to be suppressed, public discourse of all kinds had to be monitored and regulated. The text for the opera Lenore, which eventually became Fidelio, aroused deep suspicions from authorities on multiple occasions. Joseph Sonnleitner, who had transformed an earlier French text into the libretto, conceded in his appeal to the censors that the plot did indeed involve a government official who had abused his power, but he pointed out that this was only a matter of personal revenge in Spain in the 16th century, and that the villain was subsequently punished by the court, with the whole juxtaposed against the heroism of female virtue. Spain was a conveniently remote setting for stage productions that portrayed the ruling class in a light that was nothing less than noble. Like Mozart's Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni, Beethoven's Fidelio was set there, and at a temporal move far from the present. In the end, moreover, it is an enlightened ruler, the minister of state Don Fernando, who saves the day by liberating those unjustly imprisoned. So I guess people in Vienna saw what's going on in France and was just like, nah, we don't want no revolution here. And so there was a lot of stuff going on to censor people. And apparently Spain was an easy country to pick fun at. So even to this day, I think Spain is looked down upon for some reason. Anyways, but back to Bonds. The conversation books abound with grumblings by Beethoven as well as his companions about the climate of repression. At one point, his young assistant Karl Holz observed that one has to travel to North America to give one's ideas free rein. In another entry, the composer's nephew Karl admonished the composer not to be so open about his opinions in the coffee houses where Beethoven liked to spend afternoons with friends or a newspaper. Quote, "Silence! The walls have ears." End quote. But the police on the whole gave Beethoven a fairly wide berth, in part because of his fame, in part because they regarded him as something of an eccentric, in part because they believed that instrumental music posed no threat to the social order. Or so they thought. In one especially intriguing entry in a conversation book from 1823, the poet and playwright Franz Grillparzer told the composer that, quote, "The censor cannot hold anything against musicians. If they only knew what you think about in your music." True, right? Censorship cannot censor the things in your mind, and sometimes your thoughts are ambiguated in instrumental music, right? Back to Bonds. Among cognoscenti at first, instrumental music in general and symphonies in particular were in fact regarded as sublimated forms of public expression. They likened the symphony to an ideal society in which each instrument contributed its own distinctive voice to a harmonious whole. Though the political content of any given symphony might be opaque, the very act of performing one constituted a political statement of its own kind. Beethoven would take full advantage of this in his Ninth Symphony, with its message of joy as a unifying element of all humanity. That's it. That's the end of Chapter 7. Hope y'all are enjoying. We got maybe like 2 or 3 chapters left. Kind of cool, huh? Getting a good taste of all the stuff that Beethoven is. Well, the next chapters are actually really the meaty stuff. It's really about like his really it's been really alluding to Beethoven's idea of pursuing his art. It's been kind of an assumption, but the next couple chapters really dig deep into his commitment to making sure that his compositions are really good. So, more on that. Thank you all. Hope you enjoyed. Look forward to next time.